okay, we got an issue. And then you learn how to run a war room, which is, that was our Saturday night. That was our Sunday morning, and by Sunday morning, Adrian thought he and his team had cleaned up everything, got the hacker out. And then we realized Monday afternoon, no, we left this other side door open. And it was just one customer, but, there were tickets that Habbo Hotel customers had filed that had their credit cards in it.
Thank you for joining Tools for Tech Leaders. This is a podcast for leaders in C-suites across the industry, finding ideas that resonate and that are useful to them. Our guest today is Zack Urlocker, a tech exec and leader in some of the world's most impactful companies, including MySQL, Zendesk, Duo Security, and Active Software. He's contributed to over $20 billion in shareholder returns over his career. He's the author of the upcoming book, Build to Scale, based on his experiences and writings in his popular Build to Scale Substack. I'm so excited to have Zack Urlocker on our podcast today. Welcome, Zack.
Hey, Ian.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining. And I'd love to talk about, things that you've learned in your career, the journey that you've been on. Maybe a great place to start, given, Mattermost is an open source company, is MySQL. MySQL has been one of the building blocks of the internet. And it's that sort of classic case study between open source and proprietary approaches. Can you tell us a little bit about your role there and your journey in the early days?
Yeah, so I joined MySQL when the company was still quite small. It was doing about maybe 5 million in bookings a year, and it was predominantly a licensing model. We had a GPL open source license, but for people who wanted to embed MySQL into their appliance or applications, there was also a commercial license available. And originally I ran marketing, and after a few years, I was later running engineering, product, and marketing all together.
And could you share just a little bit more about MySQL's business model? Tell us a little bit about the GPL license and the commercial license and how that piece works. A lot of folks are into open source and very curious about those different models.
In the early days of MySQL, it had a really simple business model, which was if you wanted to embed MySQL into an appliance or application without open sourcing your own code, then you needed a commercial license, and MySQL was the commercial entity that could grant that license because we had written all the software. And at the time, open source was still kind of mysterious. Linux was out there, Red Hat was successful, there was JBoss on the infrastructure side, but there weren't a lot of open source businesses at that time. And one of the things that I saw was the opportunity to kind of evolve MySQL into more of a subscription business model. And that was also something that was extremely rare in the software world at that time. Normally, you just bought an annual license, server license, or per seat licensing for most software products. And I felt that we could get to a better alignment model for enterprise customers, because the enterprise customers weren't beholden to kind of the complexities of the GPL requiring a commercial license. And so I thought that the subscription model would fit there, and indeed that's kind of the business that we built. And over some number of years, it grew to about 100 million in mostly subscription revenues.
That's awesome. Like 5 to 100 million in the early days of MySQL is sort of massive. I mean, those numbers are, for the time, scaled up or really quite incredible. When you think about like, how did you get there? What are your thoughts on like from 5 to 100 million in this open source sort of brand new market? What were some of the key inflection points? What do you think had the biggest sort of impact on that revenue journey?
The biggest impact for MySQL was simply that the world was changing, and the old world of on-premise software was kind of disappearing. And I felt that it was better to be a disruptor and start something, be a part of a newer trend than try to kind of hold down the old trends. And we were very fortunate in that the web was taking off, and MySQL was really a fantastic database for web development. And it sounds funny to say it, but the other database companies weren't doing that. And the web was kind of this obscure area that big companies like Microsoft and IBM, and they didn't care about. So MySQL became the world's best web database, and that kind of drove our growth. So the fact that there was a new class of web developers who were looking to build front ends using tools like or languages like PHP, Perl, and Python. And part of our strategy at MySQL was to make sure we had great performance with those newer languages.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Can you tell us a little bit about that go-to-market piece? So you got this web demand, you have this market. What is the biggest impact in terms of, is it like lots of big deals? Is it a tremendous amount of smaller deals? Like how that sales motion and sort of customer journey work?
So one of the things that drove a lot of the growth at MySQL was simply that because it was open source and effectively free for most users, people would just go download MySQL and try it out themselves. And we were getting 30,000 downloads per day. And there's probably some people who downloaded it twice, but by any measure, it was these were big numbers. And the commercialization of MySQL was always a very, very slim percentage. It was, around 1%, sometimes 1.1% commercialization. So the fact that the database industry is very large meant you have lots of people out there trying out MySQL for the first time, getting a flavor for it, learning it. Maybe it's their first database, or maybe they're looking for cost-effective ways to deploy databases with web applications. But MySQL basically became the de facto choice for people. And so we basically made it easy for people to get MySQL, to download it, to run it on every operating system that was out there: Linux, Mac, Windows, all kinds of obscure kind of mini computer operating systems. There was a version of MySQL for it. Of course, the big growth markets were really Linux and Windows were the big ones.
When you think about MySQL and this mass amount of free usage you got across, Windows and Linux and all these different platforms, what are the one or two sort of paid features that move people over? Like what was the best conversion? Or is it more segmented, or is there one sort of converging feature that everyone kind of goes for? There in today's sort of modern world, SAML SSO feels like that, free to paid conversion fulcrum. What was it back in the MySQL days?
In the MySQL days, it was not kind of an open core model where there's some features that are free and some that are paid, because we had the philosophy that database has to be useful. You can't say, hey, the database is free, but if you use stored procedures, you got to pay, or the database is free up to a certain size and then you got to pay. And in fact, it was quite funny because as MySQL was chugging along, having a free database was definitely disruptive to companies like Oracle and IBM and Microsoft SQL Server. And so they all came out with their sort of half-assed free versions of their products. And Oracle had Oracle Express, and it was free, except if you got to a certain size of storage, you had to pay. And no developer in their right mind is ever going to use a product like that, because they're like, well, if I'm successful, I'm penalized. And, so Oracle Express didn't work. And in their infinite creativity, Microsoft had SQL Server Express and IBM had DB2 Express. And they all had these Express editions, which were expressly lousy copies of MySQL, so to speak. Meaning they tried to say, well, what matters is having it be free. But what they did is they created crippleware products that nobody really wanted to use. And so for us, it was really more the guiding instinct was, if you didn't want to adhere to the GPL, and the GPL had some funny clauses that basically said, it's kind of a reciprocal license. It says if you use it, then your software should also be free. And for a lot of people, they didn't want to do that. They liked that MySQL was free, but they didn't want to make their software open source. And then as we started to get to more of the enterprise audience, and we saw people using MySQL for cloud applications and web-based systems, then we created a subscription offering called MySQL Enterprise. And there it was really about surrounding MySQL by more capabilities that included a really good knowledge base, premium level support, and having a rules-based engine that helped you determine whether you were running MySQL in an optimal fashion. And we kind of thought of this as a MySQL DBA expert in the box. It's not really in a box, it's on the cloud, but it would basically alert you to misconfigurations or queries that weren't optimal, et cetera. And for commercial users or enterprise customers, it was kind of a simple value proposition. If you're not a MySQL expert, then having MySQL Enterprise lets you be a MySQL expert. And what we found, though, was really for many, many users, 99% of all users, they don't pay us. It's fine. They're startups, they're students, they're very small scale applications. But once you got to the level where you were creating replicated databases, where uptime is really vital, then the features that were part of the MySQL Enterprise option kind of had a high value. And we were always very clear, you don't have to buy the enterprise subscription. If you have your own monitoring and management tools or open source tools like Nagios, that's cool. But if you want the thing that we think is best, then that's a commercial offering. So it was distinct in a way from MySQL being free forever, and then MySQL Enterprise being this superset of some other related capabilities, but the database itself was always free.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. I think a lot of folks, building open source business is always curious about like what the frameworks were, and MySQL had a really clear and sort of historic, iconic framework there. So thanks for sharing on those pieces.
To be fair, it took us a few years to get to that point, and sometimes the idea of like when do I pay had a very confused answer, and I felt that when the answer is confusing, it's not a very compelling story to customers. And so I really wanted to move towards this more black and white, this part's free, this part's paid, and that really simplified things for people.
Yeah, super interesting. What were some of the sort of the false starts? Like what were some of the things that were tried that was maybe a little ambiguous that you ended up sort of moving away from? And how did you kind of come to those decisions?
Well, I remember at one of the MySQL conferences, and Martin Mikos, the CEO and the guy who hired me, and he's a fantastic leader, but we would always get a question from the audience at some point. And, somebody put up their hand at the end of Martin's keynote presentation and said, when should I pay and when do I not have to pay? And Martin gave this really complicated 10-minute answer, and it had to do with, being a good citizen in the community, and if you volunteer your time as an open source developer, then you're paying us. But if you're blah blah blah, and I'm looking at the marketing team, and we're all just face palming because it's like, this is a terrible answer. And it's not anything wrong with what Martin said. It's just the philosophy was far too nuanced, and it kind of let it be a decision of conscience. Like you should pay us if you're getting a lot of value, and then you're a better person. And in my view of the world, people just don't make purchase decisions that way, at least not at the corporate level. And so instead, we evolved towards a much clearer kind of definition where there's a line of capabilities that are free, and there's another line of capabilities that are optional, but no pay, no get. And all the enterprise customers wanted was clarity. And if you have a 10-minute answer, it's not that.
Got it. That totally makes sense. When you think about that moment, do you remember what ballpark revenue that was at, like on the journey?
It was probably within, let's see, I started in the fall. So it was probably, we were probably doing about 7 or 8 million. So it was like a few months. It was my first 6 months in the company. And I went to Martin as my boss and I said, this model isn't going to work for enterprise customers. They're just not going to buy on conscience. And he was really good. And he said, okay, go fix it. And so that led to me building the MySQL Enterprise subscription offering, where we could get that alignment and this clarity of, these parts are free and these parts are commercial.
So that's kind of how MySQL was sort of built as a business. What were some of the biggest challenges, the biggest headwinds? So those are sort of internal things that you had to figure out. What are some of the external challenges that you had to go through sort of as a tech leader? And I'm really thinking about like, what are the things that the audience can learn about like difficulty and challenge and strategy and sort of reacting to external pieces in addition to the internal pieces?
Well, we were always very conscious of the fact that we're competing. We're a small company competing in a market full of giants. So you had Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, and others, and the database industry was tens of billions of dollars. And we're proud of when we get to 5 million and 10 million and 20 million of revenue, but that's mouse nuts. It doesn't matter to the big companies. So I kind of knew we had a year or two where we could be under the radar of the big competitors, and we had to kind of get traction in new markets for it to work. And initially, again, it was kind of embedded systems where Oracle or SQL Server really were overkill, or it became this kind of web applications and websites that became huge and right under the noses of CIOs who had no idea what was going on and how their webmasters and web developers were making decisions. But they were all using a lot of open source software. So there was this fundamental trend towards open source. So we kept chugging away, and we were basically triple, double kind of growth, which was fantastic. But we knew at some point, Oracle's going to wake up and they're going to recognize that we could be a threat. We could be a threat to a whole generation of new developers and new applications. And that day did come. And it was a day we called InnoDB Friday. InnoDB was one of the storage engines for MySQL. It was a transactional engine, so it had ACID compliant database transactions, which were not part of the core, kind of the original MySQL. And about half of our customers used the InnoDB engine. And InnoDB was it's basically a 3-person company in Finland. And the founders of MySQL knew Heikki, the founder of that company, and got him to build the storage engine and make it compatible with MySQL. And we kind of recognize this is a pretty strategic asset for us. We've got to maintain control over it. And we had this great license that enabled us to use InnoDB and sell it on a commercial basis. And it was open source, so that was great for our open source users. But I remember saying to the founders, like, look, we don't know what's going to happen with Heikki and who's going to show up on his doorstep. And they're like, no, Heikki loves us. He's open source through the core. And I'm like, yeah, you say that, but anything could happen. And so, Martin was down a path to try to acquire InnoDB and bring them into the company. And again, they were a 3-person or maybe 6-person company at that stage. And I remember we had a board meeting going on in London. And this was maybe the first board meeting I didn't attend in person for quite some time. I was in the office in Cupertino. It was about 1:00. I was just starting to get really hungry. Like, we got to go out and get some lunch, and had my eyes set on getting some falafel down the street in Cupertino. And at 1:00, or just a few minutes after 1, a press release went out from Oracle after the New York markets had closed, and it said, Oracle is pleased to announce the acquisition of InnoDB. We're like, what just happened? And suddenly we're really in trouble. And Martin called me up, and he had said they just got approval in that board meeting to acquire InnoDB. And then ironically, Oracle announced it. And so we were kind of a little bit of bad timing on our part. But it's like, okay, now we're in a crisis. We're in a crisis where we don't know at the end of the day, are we still in business? And I'm running marketing, so I got to figure out a way to get this message out, some kind of message, and I don't know what it is yet, but I got to get a message out to the company, our customers, our partners, our investors by 5:00, because we got a window here, and we can't let Oracle tell the story without us. And the Oracle president of Oracle called Martin and said, "Hey, we didn't do this to slow you down." Okay, great. It's kind of like, you get hit by a truck and they're like, hey, we're sorry. We didn't mean to knock you out of contention. It just happened, right? So we're scrambling, trying to figure things out. And eventually, a gentleman who worked for me, Edwin D'Souza, super creative guy. He's still with MySQL today and some of the folks on his team. And we brainstormed some ideas. And by 5 o'clock, we were able to announce MySQL has a pluggable storage engine architecture. There's InnoDB, there's this one, there's this one, there's this one, there's this one, and we're opening it up to third parties. And we welcome Oracle into the fold as, kind of owner of InnoDB. Great to have part of our ecosystem. And we got it out, and at least we kind of felt like, okay, we're still in business, and we have a contract with InnoDB, which Oracle has now inherited, but it was subject to renewal every 2 years. And I forget the exact time frame, but a few months, like it was basically subject to renewal within 6 months or something. And so we would meet, Martin and I would meet with Ken Jacobs, who was our Oracle sponsor, if you will. And he was like a super early employee. I think he was employee like 15 at Oracle. And he really understood what we were doing. He had a lot of respect for MySQL. And I think it reminded him of the good old days at Oracle. And before they were really a billion-dollar company. And we had a ton of respect for Oracle also, not only from a technical point of view, but the people and the business they had built. But we were doing something different. And every meeting with Oracle, they'd kind of pressure us to be like, hey, maybe you could have some closed source features in your product, and wouldn't that be a whole lot better? And we had to gently push back and say, hey, we hear you, but yeah, that's not what we're going to do. Because we're kind of staring down the barrel of a gun. Because if we weren't able to renew the license for InnoDB, that meant a good chunk of our commercial revenue would disappear. Not all of it, but a big chunk of it. And we would gently push back. And Martin, being from Finland, he kind of gave the analogy that this was like when the Finns negotiated with the Russian government, at gunpoint. And again, you're outgunned, you're outnumbered, you're everything. But we had a principle, and the principle was MySQL is open source, and we're not changing that. And in some ways, I think Martin and I, and maybe a few other people, maybe we had even more conviction about open source than the founders did, because I think it was a good tactic that the founders enabled, and not that they ever backed down on this particular issue, but we felt like, no, this is our raison d'etre. This is core to our business and who we are. And if we compromise and let Oracle, a competitor / partner, force us into a model that is not the model that we want, now we are competing with Oracle on their turf. And as an open source database, we kind of said, no, we want to hold our ground. Open source is the thing that brings people to us. That's why we're getting the 30,000 downloads a day. It's not because MySQL is a better database, because you could argue whether it's better or not better. It depends on the application. But it's because philosophically, we enable people to use MySQL without having to ask permission, without having to jump through hoops, without having to get approval from their boss or from anybody. And they can recompile it. They can add features. They can put it to a different operating system. They can fork it. They can do any kind of, they have all the freedoms that you could have with the software. And we felt that that was most important. So we kept pushing back. And then miraculously, the day that the Oracle InnoDB contract was supposed to renew, like it had an auto renew clause that if they didn't cancel it, it renewed. And it's like 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock. We haven't heard anything from them. We're checking, did they fax something to our office in Sweden? Maybe we should unplug the fax machine just in case. Check our spam folders. Did they email us somewhere that we didn't notice? We even gave it a second day just in case they screwed up their timing, and then we didn't hear anything from them. So Martin sent them a congratulations, and we're pleased to have you renew. And here's the invoice for the next 2 years. And the same thing happened again 2 years later. So for whatever reason, Oracle renewed the contract with us, and we don't really know why. I mean, Ken would just say, well, it was a good thing to do, but I secretly think that maybe this was just a Larry Ellison decision, and maybe he liked that we were spunky, and maybe he thought, well, it's better to have that thing going on. And there's also, Oracle had a big business running on Linux. And I think what happened was through this process, through us standing up to Oracle, sticking our ground, and seeing the reaction from the open source community, where they were very mistrustful of Oracle, I think maybe that certainly caused us to realize MySQL, the movement, is bigger than MySQL, the company. And maybe it was bigger than Oracle. That's why they renewed, because the power of the open source community, millions of developers who would have been really pissed off if Oracle had forced us to be open source, or if Oracle walked away from the NODB contract. Probably other people would have forked or come up with some new transaction engine anyways. So we were really grateful for that. And but it was definitely a stressful and tough time for us.
Yeah, thank you, Zack. It's an amazing story. I'm super curious, so I just have to ask this question. Like, how did you think about Postgres at the same time with MySQL was growing in Enterprise DB and that business? Was that in your sights, or was it less popular?
Yeah, I mean, Postgres had been around for a long time, and there'd been 4 or 5 companies that had attempted to commercialize Postgres, in those early years. And none of them really achieved any success. And we always considered Postgres and Enterprise DB to be kind of brothers in arms, that we were all competing against the big closed source databases. And we had a respect for those companies. And there were other open source databases also. And there's tools like SQLite, et cetera. And, we got to know all these companies. And I knew some of the people who were involved with Enterprise DB, and we encouraged them. They wanted to create. Their strategy was to create an Oracle compatible version of Postgres, and that was not a strategy we were doing. And so I was very curious to see how would that strategy perform in the marketplace. And the risk of when you create something that's Oracle compatible is like, well, it can be 99% Oracle compatible, but it means it's still not Oracle. And my personal view was, if you wanted Oracle, you just buy Oracle. You don't buy almost Oracle, you buy Oracle. And if necessary, you go negotiate on price and try to get a better deal. But, they'd bet on a strategy to emulate Oracle, and it was interesting. But I think other than a couple of customers like Sony, they never really took off with that strategy. And some years later, the Enterprise DB guys came to us and said, hey, maybe we should do something together. And we looked at it and we're like, oh, so it didn't really, they shared their numbers and it wasn't all that impressive. Now, I think since that time, and maybe partly because of the suspicion around Oracle, I think the Postgres community has grown a lot in recent years. And, it's a good database, but it's definitely, I would say MySQL was always a simpler database than Postgres was. And Postgres brought a lot of complexity, and there's some super advanced capabilities there. And if you need them, it's great. But otherwise, it can be a little bit, there's room for lots of different databases in the industry. But I think, we ultimately got to a $1 billion exit. And I don't think there's any Postgres technologies, or you could add up all the Postgres exits and they wouldn't amount to a fraction of that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Very different markets, the web versus sort of, enterprise DB, like by the definition.
Yeah.
I'm just also still curious about today. We've got a lot of open core companies. We have a lot of changed. We have it's a different world, and you've got the hyperscalers going out there and creating and taking that open source asset and really providing as a service, and in some ways competing against the companies that sort of created these create that open source infrastructure. How do you have any thoughts today about open source business models, licensing? Is there for today, is that open source sort of community model still viable, or do you feel like there needs to be sort of different model, different license? You've advised a lot of companies. Just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on today's market.
I think the good news is with the widespread adoption of the cloud, there is a fantastic business model, which is simply having commercialization of cloud services, where people are going to spend some amount of money for hosting plus other capabilities. And, when we were building MySQL as a company, that wasn't really around. Nobody was nobody was running anything in the cloud. You had Salesforce was kind of like the first mainstream SaaS company, and that was about it. So, and we had a notion, Mark and I had a notion that we have to figure out a strategy for commercialization in the cloud, but we ended up selling MySQL to Sun for $1 billion. And, that was a great outcome. And we just assumed Sun had some kind of cloud strategy that they were working on that we would fit into. Later, we realized Sun didn't have a whole clear strategy around the cloud, or at least not good execution around it. And so it didn't really get addressed. Now, one of the things that we observed, and I think this is maybe still true today, is there are a lot of people who will tell founders, yeah, you should pick a permissive license, no friction to slow things down. And you got to be really careful to make sure you understand who is telling you this and why are they telling you this. And I think there's a lot of BS in the industry. And of course, if you're Google or Amazon or a developer evangelist for one of those companies, it behooves you to tell founders, yeah, everything should be free. We'll take great care of you and we'll open source your thing or we'll host your thing up in the cloud and everything's going to be great. And what they really mean is, it would be in our best interest if your software was free and we could do whatever the we want with it. You good with that? So I think, again, it's a decision. It's just, and in some cases, this licensing decision works out great for the founders and their companies, and sometimes less so. But if you give away all your IP rights, you can't blame somebody else for using those. And again, it's like the thing we saw at MySQL in the early days. You can't just go to customers and say, hey, you should pay us out of good conscience. If you give away your rights, you give away your rights. And so if I was building new open source software, I would really be careful of giving too broad rights away. And I think that has hampered Amazon, Google, other companies make more. I mean, to be clear, Amazon makes more money off MySQL and Postgres than anybody in the community does, and more than any company does, and certainly more than Oracle does. And Oracle owns the MySQL IP, and nobody really owns Postgres IP anymore, I don't think. But you can still make a good living on the side of those companies, but it's really a tough proposition.
That totally makes sense. That's an excellent sort of perspective, on the past and on the current, and the model of open source. If you kind of think back over your tenure, maybe sort of wrapping up this chapter, are there any sort of tools or lessons that you've learned through this that you think about these next generation of tech execs, whether they're working in open source or freemium or infrastructure style companies? Are there sort of like a takeaway or two that's maybe a little non-obvious that were sort of like hard won, whether from yourself or your team?
Well, I think it's good to see what are the technical trends, and sometimes you have to wake up and see the obvious in front of you. In the early days, we were kind of ashamed at MySQL of all our customers are these web companies, and Yahoo uses us, and Craigslist, and .com this and .com that. And we really wanted to be enterprise. And we went down a strategy of building technology that was slightly related, is a slightly different database called MaxDB, and it was enterprise grade and getting it, SAP certified and stuff like that. And it was really friggin' hard. It was pushing a boulder uphill. But the web customers, they just loved us. And we'd meet other, buyers and executives from companies. They'd be, when are you going to have this capability? And what about stored procedures? And what about this? And what about that? And they're always cross-armed and looking for reasons. Until you have these three things, I can't buy from you. And on the website, everyone's like, just give me more, give me more. Like, MySQL is a great database because it was their first database and they didn't know what capabilities they were missing, which is fine. It was a growth market. So, and at some point, I forget what year it was, the Time Person of the Year was you. It was a metallic cover that was supposed to be like a mirror, and you look in it and it's like, it's the year of you. And it was because this was the time of all the new websites coming out doing personalized information and stuff like that. And we look at the list of those companies that were being highlighted, and every single one was a MySQL customer. And we're like, maybe this web strategy, maybe that is our strategy. You know what I mean? Like, we were doing it, but we weren't always proud of it. And we were trying to do this other thing at the same time. And at that point, we said, you know what? We're all in on the web. Now, there was also an interesting thing that happened in that era, which was there were all these independent companies competing with Oracle. And Oracle acquired every single last one of them. And so they were all incented to work with MySQL or MaxDB or something to get off Oracle. But when they were acquired by Oracle, that problem kind of went away for them and our opportunity went away. And so we really used that as a point of looking at, okay, what's really happening? And so I think sometimes you need to take a fresh perspective and look back and say, where is the industry growing? What is it that makes me unique and valuable? And let me listen to the customers who are using my stuff, not the people telling me the reasons they're not going to use it. And the more time you spend with your own customers and your own fans, the better you'll do. And we also recognize at MySQL, like, look, we have an open source model. There's good and bad with it. And, I remember Google was a big user of MySQL, and it still is. And at the time, they paid us, got up to about $1 million a year, which for us as a small company was a fantastic deal. They were our largest commercial customer. And, Facebook was a customer and other people, et cetera. But it was super exciting for us to have Google and Facebook and these guys. And sometimes the salespeople would be like, God damn, why aren't they paying us more? And if you looked at Google's revenues, 99.9% of that, or maybe 99.99% of that revenue was Google AdWords. And that was all powered by MySQL. So the value they got from MySQL was off the charts relative to what they were paying, but that's the business model we chose. And so, if there's a lesson there, it's like you got to take the good and the bad of your business model and recognize, like, hey, we're going for volume, we're going for broad distribution. That's a different approach. If you want to get paid big bucks by, if you might have to have a different business model. So.
Got it. Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. So what I got there is listen to the market and listen to people that are saying yes, and a little bit less to people that are saying no. And how do you repeat your yeses, and how do you scale and find repeat customers?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you, Zach. So that was a fantastic chapter on MySQL. As we kind of talk about transformation and this sort of product-led journey that's kind of been a cornerstone of your career, I'd love to learn a little about your time at Zendesk. And, where was the sort of starting point? How was that journey? And just a little bit of context on that path.
Yeah. So, after we sold MySQL to Sun, I stayed around at Sun for a while, and then Sun was acquired by Oracle. And then I just wanted to get out of it and do something new. And of course, I had every open source database, MongoDB, CouchDB, Cloudera. They were all trying to ping me to join their companies. And for me, I like to do something more different than more of the same. And there's a certain amount of intensity and craziness in the open source world, and I just wanted to do something else. So I ended up teaming up with Zendesk. They were at it was fairly early stage. Again, they were doing maybe 5 or 6 million in ARR. Peter Fenton from Benchmark was on the board. I was on the board of another company with him, and they were trying to scale up the company and grow. And they basically had one salesperson, and I think they kind of recognized that they needed to add a little bit more experienced management to the founders. Mikkel, Alex, and Morton were all really good guys, but they had not grown a company before. And they had made a couple of mistakes. There was kind of a famous pricing mistake that they screwed up, and I think that became the impetus for bringing somebody else into the company, just to not make the same kind of mistakes. So I was grateful for that. And initially they said, well, how about VP of marketing? And I'd done the VP marketing role many times, and I also ran engineering at MySQL, so I didn't want to do that. But it ended up becoming a COO role where I ran marketing, sales, support services, product marketing, stuff like that. And it was really a fun time. This was early in the days of SaaS, and so you had some success out there with Salesforce, NetSuite, but there weren't a lot of SaaS companies at this time. And one of the things I did before I joined Zendesk or MySQL or any of the companies I've been involved with is I go reach out and I talk to prospects and customers before I join. And one of the common things I observed when talking to Zendesk customers was they loved the product. I mean, not liked it, loved it. It was fantastic. It changed the lives of the people who were working on it. Same with MySQL, same with Duo Security. And so I felt that there was this enthusiasm for Zendesk, which was going into a fairly boring space. Customer support software, yay! Nobody was excited about it, other than Zendesk customers, because you had all these legacy products that were super complicated and not really very friendly or easy to use. And what really was happening was SaaS was introducing a new type of company that was sort of democratizing the applications, effectively saying the caliber of the experience you have on the web as a consumer is fantastic. But when you go to use your enterprise software, it sucks. It sucks like it's stuck in 1993. And Zendesk and other companies were modernizing that and making it much more user-friendly, easier to get results, not a complicated setup, et cetera. And so I joined. It was a fun time. I did ask the founders one thing before I joined, which is, hey, we gotta have a quote enterprise offering, because at the time Zendesk cost like $49 a seat, and that's per month. But that's a pretty low price, and our average deal size was $748 a year. Not a lot of money. And we had one sales guy, and I said, look, we got to go hire some additional inside sales reps, but I got to give them an average sale price that makes it a little bit meatier. And Adrian, who ran engineering at the time, he's like, absolutely, yes, we'll figure this out. We'll have a quote enterprise version, whatever that means. And, we figured it out, and Adrian and the product team were great. They built out some new features so we could have a slightly higher price version. And, that meant we could see a bump in sales. And basically we were we tripled, doubled. It was just a phenomenal growth period, because there were all these small companies getting started, and they weren't going to go buy, old school Siebel customer service software and stuff like that. It just wasn't going to happen. So Zendesk didn't have to be better than Right Now or Siebel or other things. It had to be better than shared email inbox, which is what people were doing. And so we built really it was a very lean product, not a lot of complexity, but did the job and did it really, really well. And Zendesk basically became the thing for hot startups to use. And so at that, our customers were like Twitter, Airbnb, these kind of high growth companies, Groupon, which was crazy explosive growth company out of Chicago, and they were all using Zendesk.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So that is, transformational story, definitely Mattermost, since the early days, we've been a Zendesk customer. And I'm kind of curious about like that transition to that cloud. You get a lot of on-prem security. Today we have GDPR and that sort of level of trust. When you think about, now you've got all the customer data, not only of your customer, but of their customers. And it's sort of a different model in the early days of the internet when you're thinking about like privacy and risk and sort of, cyber threats. When you think about, that in the early days, how did that form? How did you think about earning the trust of that community that was so used to controlling their own data?
Well, I think for a lot of customers in that era, these startups, they were cloud-based startups, and they weren't really having the question of like, should we put stuff in the cloud? They're like, Zendesk, that's what the other guys are using. That's what I'll use. And so that was our first cohort. So, and as we started growing and trying to sell to enterprise customers, we realized very early on, we can't be their first cloud application. If we're the first cloud application, we're going to get shot down and they're going to say, this is a crazy idea. So at the very least, they have to have Salesforce or some other CRM running in the cloud. And, they've got 2 or 3 cloud applications. That's going to make it so much easier for us. So that was one of the kind of qualification questions we would use when talking to customers. But Zendesk was incredibly top of funnel driven. So it was web traffic came in, and there was really only one thing you could do on the Zendesk website: sign up for a trial. There were no other calls to action. And so people would sign up for a trial, and then, if they got their Zendesk set up in 3 to 5 days, then that was a positive sign, and they would start messing around, trying things out. And then a good chunk of them would convert within the first week. And it was a 30-day trial, but most of the conversions happened in the first 7 to 10 days. And it was really a volume game. It was high predictability. Like we could predict based on web traffic, like a 99% confidence of where the quarter will end. And sales cycles were, 30 to 45 days, but again, not big amounts. And of course, as we added new capabilities, we started talking to larger customers. And there was a transformation going on also, which is, companies like Box or Dropbox, who are our customers, or Airbnb, they were starting to bring in senior executives on customer success side and support. And or companies had multiple brands, and they'd be like, okay, well, how do you deal with multiple brands? And we're like, I guess that's going to be one of those enterprise features we work on. So we had to really listen to our customers because they were rapidly scaling at a pace faster than we were. And it's one thing to run a help desk for 10 people, but if you've got 100 people or 1,000 people, like, okay, you got to have different things in place. You need access control. You need to limit what people can see. You have to have some sense of security, or at least separating some incidents from others. Over time, you have to deal with issues like, I want a U.S. citizen looking at these issues. We didn't have any of that in the early days. In fact, even Zendesk internally was, I won't say cavalier, but I will say, did not have good separation of who has access to systems at any given point. Like as an employee in Zendesk, I had access to everything, every customer's tickets, and you could inadvertently screw up. You might log into Zendesk and then suddenly you're in the customer emulation mode or whatever. And you're like, no, you're actually on their site. And if you change the colors, you just change the colors of that customer's site. And so and that happened, routinely. New employee comes on, we say, hey, just run some experiments, try it out. And next thing you know, customers are telling us, hey, the colors on my Zendesk all changed. What's going on? Oh, okay. And so I went to the engineering team and I said, we got to put some controls in place. Like Yeah, the support team should have access to certain things, but like not everybody should have access to everything all the time. So we had to grow up and mature a little bit. And that's normal in any SaaS company. You don't build all the controls from day one that you need, when you're an enterprise customer. Otherwise, you might never launch your product. Now it's easier today to get a lot of this stuff done than it was back then, but we had to grow up. And at some point, we also had I think every company goes through this. You have an incident of some kind that is very sobering, and it becomes a test of the company's fortitude of how to deal with a crisis. And we had a crisis.
What was the crisis?
The crisis was we had a customer in Finland, Habbo Hotel, which was a gaming company for teenagers, basically. And one Saturday, a Dutch teenager, probably 15 years old, connected to Zendesk, filed a ticket and said, hey, I need to reset my password. And of course, we had weekend people working on the weekend. We had a relatively new employee, young guy in Florida, remote. And he said, well, I can't just reset your password. You have to send it from an email address that looks like this. Okay, he told them how to spoof. So this kid, he just spoofed an email address from that site, and he got a password. And it was some hours later, like around 8:00 Saturday night, we realized something's gone wrong. We got a breach. There's somebody in this system. We figured out quickly what had happened. He was socially engineered. And of course, when you're socially engineered, there's probably some huge emotional push like, hey, I got to fix this. Otherwise, my boss is going to be on my case and blah, blah, blah. I got to reset it. And he fell victim to that. And suddenly we're scrambling. And I remember I lived down in Santa Cruz. The office was in San Francisco. The customers in Europe. I had to call the general manager in Europe, Matt Price. Stayed at Zendesk for a long time. Adrian, we're getting them all on conference calls. Okay, we got an issue. And then you learn how to run a war room, which is, that was our Saturday night. That was our Sunday morning, and by Sunday morning, Adrian thought he and his team had cleaned up everything, got the hacker out. And then we realized Monday afternoon, no, we left this other side door open. And it was just one customer, but there were tickets that Habbo Hotel customers had filed that had their credit cards in it. So this hacker had access to lots of information. And then, of course, we notified the customer, immediately as soon as we were on it. And they were like, oh, yeah, we knew this was going to happen. They're like, what do you mean you knew this was going to happen? Well, this kid's been trying to hack into our main systems for a while, and we knew that they would do this. It's like, okay, well, thanks for letting us know. And then the FBI got involved, and we had to convey all kinds of information there. And of course, you never really know, like, is the FBI going to act on this? It's a teenager. They're probably just doing it for a prank. I mean, I'm not sure there was really any super vital information. They weren't able to bring down Zendesk or Habbo Hotel or anything, but still, you don't want somebody with that kind of information selling it on the dark web or anything like that. So eventually the FBI didn't really share too much of how they handled it on their side. And I think the customer didn't want to talk about it either because they were embarrassed. But, it's a crisis. And so you have to use a crisis as a way to learn hey, we got to be serious about security. We got to train people. And, I called up the support rep in Florida and I said, so how'd this happen? And he's like, I didn't want to bug Mike Warren, my boss, on a weekend. I'm like, okay, no. That's why you have a boss. You need to be comfortable. It's way better to raise a red flag and find out it's not an issue than to not raise the red flag. And, again, he probably felt bad. He didn't want to be the boy who cries wolf, creating a false storm. But, it was a little bit of a mess for a couple of days, but we got it straightened out. And, and then of course we instituted better training and a little bit more security practices. And again, more cleaving off stuff so that people have limited access from one area to another, but basically good hygiene. And whenever you have a crisis, you got to respond quickly. You got to move. You can't just look up at the ceiling and say, "Hey, maybe we'll take a wait and see attitude." Like, it's all hands on deck. Communicate clearly to the people involved. Make it clear what the next steps are. If you got people in different time zones, use them to advantage. Get the crisis resolved, and then later figure out how to institute improvements, systemic improvements, training improvements, software improvements, all those things. But what you don't want to do is have a lot of finger pointing, blame game. If you yell at somebody figuratively or literally in that kind of situation, what you do is you create an environment where people don't want to share bad news, because they see, like, hey, if you screw up, you get yelled at, and that doesn't feel good for anybody. And again, you don't have to praise somebody for screwing up, and you should take note, like, if they screw up repeatedly, maybe they shouldn't be in the company. But everybody screws up sooner or later. That's the nature of being young. And you can't hold that lack of experience against somebody, because, we hired them. And if we want somebody who had 10 years experience, we should have hired somebody with 10 years experience, but we didn't do that, because, shame on us. So again, it got all sorted out in the end, but you see under pressure how people behave and what their real character is. And I think you really want to have a light touch in those situations.
Yeah, thank you, Zack. I think that makes a ton of sense, especially people who've been through these crises. Maybe one thing to ask before we move on to Duo Security, where we talk about the sort of journey of security as an industry, is when you think, looking back at Zendesk and those really trying times, how do you think about training people for those, other than like putting them through the crucible, right? How do you coach someone that is an up and coming leader that hasn't yet faced one of these crises and been the leader on that war room and those playbooks? What are some things you would do to prepare that next generation of leadership?
Well, I think for things like security, you have to run drills. You got to do red teams. You got to do pen testing. You have to recreate that kind of pressure. And it's not genuine in the sense that people know it's an exercise, but it still is useful, because what you want to be clear on is kind of the notion of who's in charge, who's making the decisions, and get people used to over communicating in those situations. And again, focusing on the solution rather than the blame. And it's not going to come second nature to people. I mean, for people who are in the security teams, they're used to this kind of approach. But I think it's a good approach now and then. And for managers and leaders, what I try to do is I try to push decision-making down in the organization, because you have to train people in making decisions. And in a lot of startups, and at Zendesk, we saw this in the early days, Mikkel said to me, the CEO, he said, I got this big line of people outside my office every day. How do I fix that? I said, the reason they keep lining up outside your office is because you keep making decisions, and you need them to make the decisions. So quite often, I consciously push decision-making down in the organization. I want to see managers make decisions. I'm not going to second guess them. If it's an absolute critical, like the building's burning down, like, yeah, I'm going to weigh in on a decision. But routine decisions, you need them to make those. Because it's only if they make routine decisions and they get to see, okay, the decision worked or didn't work, that they learn, so that when the shit hits the fan of a crisis, they're able to exercise that muscle and make judgments and decisions, and be in the moment when speed is of the essence, and communicating to customers is critical. And you can't have people off to the side not knowing what's going on when there's a serious security breach or outage or other issues. So I think just making sure you're developing real leaders in the organization and making them feel accountable and responsible, and that they get to make the decisions. They get to make the decisions, and they have to make the decisions. And you also see in that exercise, who doesn't want to make decisions? Because if you're a manager and you don't want to make decisions, you don't get to be manager anymore. And that's okay, because if they're really uncomfortable with it, maybe they should be in a different role as an individual contributor.
Yeah, thank you, Zach. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, how do you prepare people for that crisis and that accountability? It's really, every day pushing decisions down, getting them ready for those moments. So, thank you. So we've got a little bit of time left. I'd love to talk about Duo Security, that journey there, another transformation, of the industry, and would love to hear again, sort of like that maturation story. So when did you join? What was the journey like, and what were some of the biggest challenges you had along the way?
So I moved to Michigan, where my wife is from, and I wanted to be in the security industry. And I managed to connect with Duo Security, which was the only cybersecurity company of any significance in Michigan at the time. They were in Ann Arbor. And originally, I started as an advisor to Doug, John, the founders, and helping them on some, go-to-market issues and strategies, et cetera. And I knew some of the investors. It was Benchmark, whom I'd worked with at MySQL and Zendesk. And eventually, they hired me on an interim basis to help them launch a product. And within about 30 or 60 days, I ended up becoming COO. And it was, again, very early stage. I think they were doing 6 million in revenue. It was maybe 25 employees. And again, I did my research. I called up customers. I signed up for a trial. I went through the SDR process, to hear the pitch from a sales rep and stuff like that. And, make sure that they seem like they're on the ball and that people are happy with the product. And, the founders really built an interesting a product and a culture. And it was, it's in Michigan where I live today, and people are nice here. There's tremendous respect and loyalty that people had. So you didn't have people jumping from one company to the other. We were able to retain our employees. Ann Arbor is kind of like Palo Alto for a third the price. So, you can be an engineer a few years out of school and you can afford to buy a house. Maybe not downtown Ann Arbor, but you can buy a house and, it's good. And in many ways, Duo was the most fun of the companies I worked with, just because there was so much energy, and we're building kind of the next generation of leaders kind of every day. And I was able to bring in a couple of people I'd worked with previously at Zendesk, at MySQL. So guys like Jim Sibb, who ran sales, Jeff Wiss, who ran marketing. I hired a new head of product, Ash Devada, who's now CEO of a company. And it was really an exciting time because, let's face it, if somebody says, hey, I got a new security initiative I want to implement, you're kind of like, oh God, save me. What is this mess? And then you show them Duo Security, and it's like, hey, it's on your phone. It's really easy. You just click the green button, and people are like, wow, this is great. Let me see that again. It's fun. It's a cool product. It's making the world a little bit safer against phishing attacks and other kind of exploits. And we grew at a tremendous rate. And of course, even at Zendesk, I used to share our metrics with, of course, with the board, but also with other founders and CEOs of companies like HubSpot and Box and Dropbox. And Zendesk numbers were very good, probably better than a lot of companies. And then Duo's metrics were like off the charts. I mean, it was so efficient that we were often cash flow positive, by accident. You could say just because we were growing at a really fast rate, but sometimes we couldn't hire as fast as we were growing. So it was a good time.
Yeah, excellent. And when you think about that maturation process, that sort of trial by fire, what are the hard times, the ones that are just kind of prove the mettle of the people there, and what were those kind of inflection points like?
Every startup, we had a band at Duo, and one of our values in the company was kinder than necessary. So me and Chester, the head of engineering, we created a band, and we called it Louder Than Necessary. And we weren't necessarily the most talented people, but we had fun. We played picnics and corporate events. And one of the songs we used to play is a cover of a Bob Dylan song called Everything is Broken. And I think Chester really got a kick out of that because that's kind of what startup world is, right? You're looking under rocks. There's things that are broken. There's systems that are breaking. Customers are stressing out your products at a scale that you didn't anticipate, or integrating with things that, like, I don't know, is that going to work or not? And it's a startup. So you let them try these things and you cross your fingers and you hope everything works out. And generally speaking, everything worked at Duo. It was a very good company. And the first, few years, I think they had 100% uptime because the 2FA process, I mean, it's not very taxing, really. So like you don't have a lot of customer data going back and forth and stuff like that. It was very efficient. But at some point, we started to sell to universities. And universities all had these ancient systems, so they had to do Active Directory sync process. And we had a good enough process, but we'd probably only tested it with 100 or 1,000 records, something like that. And the first day of school, you got thousands or tens of thousands of students logging into Duo for the first time and triggering an Active Directory sync process. And next thing you know, we got, boom, it's blowing up, the server's crashing. And Penn State was one of our large early university customers. They just took down not only their system, everybody on that server. And then you peel back the onion and you realize, we've been putting everybody on this default server one instead of distributing them across multiple servers for very obscure reasons that were not very good. And it's like, oh shoot, we got this noisy neighbor problem, which is it's not so bad that Penn State blew up because they were doing something that we hadn't anticipated, but they brought down 40% of our other customers. And so then we had to really get serious about it. And I wasn't running engineering at the time, but I was later on. But I sat down with Chester and the engineers. I said, folks, look, we got really serious people using our product now. And universities, we have hospitals, we have banks. And, if the hospital can't log into the system, it's not good. This isn't just selling to another startup down the street, and if it blows up, well, they start over. This is like, and I had to put it like, somebody made a decision to buy Duo Security. That person's job is on the line when we fail. So we can't fail. We have to be 100% uptime, and we got to get back to this. And again, we had a couple outages over a couple of weeks that was just, each one got fixed fairly quickly, but, customers will always forgive you. They'll forgive you once, but, if you get 3 outages, now luckily they were across different servers, but, people forgive you once, they might forgive you twice. After the third time, they're just like, hey, I'm sorry. I can't get fired because you guys can't keep your systems up. So we had to reprioritize engineering and say, P0 is reliability and uptime. And this trumps everything else. And so I got the engineers, the managers together and on one of the core groups and said, okay, we're going to brainstorm all the ideas we can about how we can improve uptime. And we got some good ideas. We got some not so good ideas. But, in the spirit of brainstorming, we're going to look at everything. And I said separately, Chester and I will go evaluate these and maybe pull in, John O, co-founder, CTO, or some other people to figure out which ones have the best bang for the buck. And at some point, one of the engineers, or maybe it was a manager, I forget who, said, okay, but what about all the features we're supposed to do? We're supposed to ship this new version, et cetera. I said, no, that's off the table. When we say this is P0, this is the top priority, it means the other things are not the priority. And then the real question was, okay, but what are Doug and John going to say? Doug and John being the founders. And I said, don't worry, I have your back. I will go to them and I will tell them, look, we need to fix this stuff. Because if you're a security product, you can have all the features in the world, but if you don't have 100% uptime, 100% reliability, those features don't matter to the customer. They will move on. And of course, Doug and John understood that. So it's not like I needed to convince them. And they said, okay, great. But what if we slip 60 days? I got your back. What if we slip 120 days? Okay, well, we'll have a conversation. If we're still kind of triaging at that point, maybe we have to figure out something else. But the key message was when you make something the top priority, you have to deprioritize other things. You cannot say, I got top priority to ship and top priority quality and top priority to get into this market and top priority. Because if you have 5 top priorities, everybody's going to interpret them differently. And now you have no priority. And when you allocate resources to a top priority, you have to deallocate resources. And when you're reprioritizing things for people, everybody hears the big message. Okay, priority 0 is uptime and reliability. But I got this thing I'm supposed to be working on. And you actually have to go back to every single individual and say, okay, what's on your plate this week? That thing is not top priority anymore. Remember when we said in the meeting, oh, yeah, but I thought you were talking about other people. No, we're talking about you too. So you really have to manage that communication and reprioritization at an individual level, because by default, people will continue to work on the thing that they were working on before. And nobody wants to leave something in a half-finished state. And so they're like, well, can I wrap this up? Yeah, you can wrap it up if you wrap it up today. But you don't get a week to wrap it up. Like, we got to move on to the new thing, et cetera. And, there's always ups and downs as you scale, because it's really hard to build an architecture that scales. And, when you grow 10x, 100x, okay, you can probably do that within a given architecture. When you're 3 orders of magnitude larger than where you started, you cannot anticipate what the bottlenecks will be. Meaning you can't predict, like, hey, we got an active directory sync process. It's pretty good, but we didn't know that was going to be the bottleneck. So you got to re-architect that, or maybe it's something else. So as you're scaling a company 2, 3, 4, 5 orders of magnitude, there's always stages where you have to re-architect the systems so that things that are critical, things that you might not have anticipated. And some things you can fix by getting bigger servers or more memory. And some things you're like, who wrote that code? And there was, there's always crafty code that, I remember that Jono would say, like, hey, there's some things that I wrote, like, we got to get that out of there. We got to put some real people on that stuff. And sometimes you don't know what those things are until you're deep in the weeds. And then you see, it's like, okay, the workload is different than we ever could have anticipated, the mix of transactions or reporting or whatever things. So you don't want to try to create infinite scalability on day one, because you'll never ship. But you also can't let too much technical debt accumulate where bad things can happen. And, and in a startup, small problems become big problems very quickly. So if you have an issue it's not great, but it's in the red, it's using up 95% CPU time. It's like, okay, well, we better go refactor that or find a different approach or, redo things.
Yeah, thank you, Zack. This was an amazing conversation. I always learn so much, when we're together and have a chance to discuss. And as you talk about, building to scale, I'd love to maybe learn a little about the Build to Scale community on Substack, how people can find more. If you write a lot, you've got lots of, talks and presentations. Where's the best way to sort of double click on some of the things that you've learned sort of beyond this podcast?
So yeah, I'm writing a book called Build to Scale. It's all these lessons of the good lessons, the hard lessons that I've learned along the way. And I try to be generous in my time to founders, because it is really hard to build a company. And, sometimes it's just great to talk to somebody else and get some wisdom. And so I'm trying to put all of that on the page, so to speak. I'm about halfway through the book. I'm publishing on Substack as I go. So buildtoscale.substack.com. It's free. It'll always be free. At some point, there'll be a book, hopefully later in 2024. And it's really intended for founders, CEOs, CTOs, executives, or people who want to be in those kind of environments, and have somebody kind of give you some advice of what might go wrong and what are some lessons, whether it was at Zendesk or MySQL or other companies where, I've been on the board or an advisor or something. And, hopefully helping people avoid making the mistakes that, I've made or other people have made in the past.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Zack. It was great to have you on the show. For anyone that likes this content, please like, comment, subscribe, and there's more to come. So thank you so much for being with us today, Zack.
It was a lot of fun, Ian.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like this content, please join our LinkedIn group. Please thumbs up, please comment, please subscribe. We'd love to bring more of this content to you.